the people go through the markets and see all of these beautiful fruit, I don't think that most people think very much as to who produced, who did all the labor. Minimum wages does not permit any family or anybody to be able to live adequately. But we still enjoy very much our cheap produce in the stores and markets.
Migrant workers cultivate, harvest, and pack our nation's produce from farm to market and onto our tables, providing the fresh fruits and vegetables essential for healthy lives. As they follow the crops, some live in decent housing. Others live in rundown trailers, unsanitary farm labor camps, and overcrowded conditions. These poor living conditions put them at risk for serious health problems, which can affect the entire community.
Adequate housing is pretty basic. I would say it ought to be in our Bill of Rights, where people should have at least a dry roof over their head and basic sanitation, drinking water, sewage disposal, out of the elements.
I'm sure you've seen very substandard conditions that the farm worker community is living in, and other low-paid workers who work and have two incomes for that household are forced to live in overpriced or overcrowded or extremely substandard conditions when they're making a living. They're doing everything that according to the rules, and yet still can't break through that very, very primary need.
Migrant farm workers are integral to agricultural communities. Construction of affordable and decent housing for these workers meets a fundamental human need and protects farm workers' families. Decent housing for farm workers protects public health and strengthens the economic vitality of farming communities. Across America, there is a growing realization that community groups must be involved in creating housing for migratory farm workers. In doing so, they can replace the public's fear and misconceptions about farm workers with facts. North of San Diego, about 30 farm worker families live in Camp Kelly. The houses are crude. Aside from open fires, there is no heat, no electricity, and no running water.
We have to get water from the stream to wash our dishes, and it's unhygienic. We often get sick from it.
When we get water from the stream, we try to get it as early in the morning as possible, so it's clean.
Normally it's cold. Because the houses don't have good insulation, it gets really cold.
In the long run, I think that it's very difficult to be able to maintain the health of your family for the entire year because of the exposure to the elements. The child had gone in for a well baby exam and had come home. The child was healthy, the child was fine, but because of the exposure, it was extremely cold during that week. The child died. We feel that partially due, it could have been because of the lack of blankets, warm clothing, electricity, because of the housing conditions.
A focus group of health and social service providers meeting in May 1996 agreed that substandard housing leads to serious health problems for farm workers. Lack of potable water and sanitary facilities contributes to a high occurrence of gastroenteritis. Overcrowding accelerates the spread of infectious diseases. Lack of bathing facilities and clean water for washing clothes prevents farm workers from being able to wash pesticide residues from their skin and clothing. Rashes and skin problems frequently result. No refrigeration increases the risk of food poisoning and can diminish the potency of liquid antibiotics commonly prescribed for children.
I think the children of migrant farm worker families are the most affected by housing conditions. Respiratory infections are our biggest, probably our biggest health problem, and I think that children are more sensitive to changes in climate, and when there's problems with lack of heat, when there's problems with overcrowding.
Migrant camps are usually close to fields regularly sprayed with pesticides. Wind drift and drainage expose farm workers to hazardous chemicals.
The apple trees, they get sprayed once in a week, and they're right next to our trailers. There's always children under the trees.
I was visiting a camp one time. The kids were playing in the field where the cucumbers were, and a small plane came over and started spraying the field, and I was surprised that would happen so blatantly, but it does, and those children know that it's bad when the plane comes, and of course they ran out of the field, but they went right back out to play in the field, and it's hard to keep kids out of a place that's their playground.
The focus group revealed that anxiety and depression frequently reported among farm workers is exacerbated by the housing crisis. The inability to obtain shelter erodes feelings of self-worth. Crowded living conditions can mean no privacy for the most basic bodily functions. These circumstances combine to create stress, which in turn can make farm workers more susceptible to substance abuse and domestic violence. Farm workers' health problems affect their community as a whole.
Infectious diseases don't respect any borders, and when there's significant outbreaks of infectious disease in a community, everyone's at risk.
In the migrant seasonal farm community, you know, if you can raise the standard just a little bit, you can make a big improvement throughout the entire population. Not just the farm worker population, but the population in general.
Historically, growers provided temporary labor camps. Many still do. John Hinkleman provides mobile homes for the migrant workers he employs.
With the mobile homes, the people always have a hot shower, hot and cold running water. They have heat. For the most part, you'll return families on a pretty regular basis with good housing.
Living conditions at grower-provided housing vary widely. When farm worker housing standards are strengthened, two things occur. Some housing units are improved, but others are abandoned.
We've not seen any new farm labor housing built by growers in Delaware or Maryland, I'd say, for the past 5 or 10 years.
Individuals like myself can't afford to go out here and build housing and keep up with all the rules and regulations. There's just no way.
Agriculture is one of the few industries in which the employer is still expected to provide housing. We as consumers benefit from the fruits and vegetables harvested by farm workers. Our communities benefit from the income generated by their purchase of goods and services. We need to be concerned about the housing crisis. Farmers and farm workers cannot solve the housing problem alone. For public health and economic reasons, and out of community pride, these communities are seeking and finding solutions to their housing problems. In the Coachella Valley, farm workers are vital to the economic well-being of its communities. The shortage of housing here means many farm workers go homeless. A community development organization, together with the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Rural Housing Service, formerly the Farmers Home Administration, have found their solution by collaborating.
The organization started with a volunteer board of community leaders. There was a varied group. There was people from the clergy, growers, people from the local school board, and other volunteers who got together with an idea to do something about the desperate need for housing. And they decided their primary focus would be farm worker housing because those were the poorest of the poor, the most in need of the housing.
One of the many successful farm worker housing programs is Pie de la Cuesta. Rosalba Hernandez and her family are residents. She and her husband work in the grape fields.
Yes, it really does help because we are farm workers who live on low-paying jobs, and these are affordable to farm workers' incomes.
I can't tell you how many times parents have actually cried when they've gotten their apartments or been told they've had the opportunity to get a better housing situation. The long-term impact is stability in the household, which would lead to opportunities for education and just a better future for the kids.
The 20 units that we have here it doesn't even touch the tremendous amount of housing that is needed throughout this area.
The Sunrise apartment complex in Keeler, Michigan, begun and built by a community organization funded by Rural Development, has for 10 years now housed migrant workers. Unfortunately, initiatives like this encounter a great deal of community resistance based on fear and misconceptions.
Well, when we looked at building this housing, we looked at the benefits to the community. One of the biggest concerns was that it is safe housing. It's very presentable. It's a plus in your community. It's not something that people are going to go by and say, "Oh, that's farm worker housing." It blends in. It works well in our community.
Before living at the Sunrise, Elvira Tomez, her husband and young children had to live in their car while seeking work and a place to live.
Sometimes the children would get sick with diarrhea from being in the car so long without drinking liquids, washing their hands to eat, or going to the bathroom. At night there were a lot of mosquitoes. I, like many mothers, would try to keep them away so the children could sleep, but they would still get bitten. This house is better for those of us who are migrants.
Sometimes community groups encounter not-in-my-backyard opposition when they are developing housing for migratory farm workers. This opposition is usually based on myths about farm laborers, such as they are a drain on the local economy to which they contribute little, and they are a threat to personal and family safety. Far more often than not, these myths are grounded in racism, classism, and fear. In 1993, an economic study revealed that if migrant farm workers were no longer available to Virginia's eastern shore, economic output would drop by over $45 million per year. Housing like the Leonard Apartments make it possible for farmers to rely on migrant workers who are vital to local farming economies.
Residents in farm labor housing want to live in that housing, and it appeals to them to live in decent housing. And so they respect the rules and regulations, take care of the units. There's been no increase in police calls, almost the exact opposite of what the public outcry was.
Matter of fact, there's less crime at Leonard Apartments than there is at some of the more affluent housing in this area. If my entire county was as crime-free as the Leonard Apartment Complex, I'd probably be unemployed.
We need more housing like Leonard Apartments nationwide. We don't have half enough here. I mean, there's no way we can get all our people in there. So I think we need to encourage more of these areas being built all over the country. It's meant a lot to me, I'll put it that way. It's the only way I'd be in business. Without it, I'd quit.
At the federal level, the only programs providing funding specifically for farm workers are the USDA's Rural Housing Service, Section 514, 516 programs. The 1996 funding level for these programs was about $20 million in loans and grants. Applications pending for funding to construct housing for farm workers was about $60 million. The resources available are less than one-third of the amount requested. Although daunting, the situation is not hopeless. There are some things that you can do to help house migratory farm workers in your community. Some states, such as Oregon and California, have created tax incentives to stimulate the development and rehabilitation of both seasonal and year-round farm worker housing. You can help raise funds for the construction of housing for farm workers. You can educate your community to raise awareness about migrant farm workers in your community and overcome opposition to construction of housing for farm workers. You can speak up in local government to help overcome zoning laws prohibiting multi-family projects. You can support tax incentive programs at the state and federal level that stimulate the development and rehabilitation of farm worker housing. Although farm workers work in remote locations and often live out of sight, they should not be out of mind. Like the seasons, migrant workers return year after year, moving crops to market and supporting local economies. They share our need for decent shelter and food. It is time to stop taking fruits and vegetables for granted and remember the working poor who put them on our table. We must work together to provide decent housing for the health and dignity of our migrant farm workers. Providing safe and decent housing benefits the entire community.